All right. Well, this is part 2 of my presentation. It's early here on a Saturday morning. Okay, so how David Koresh tried to destroy my marriage. It's a long story. So this has to do, and why he tried to. Very specific reason why. It has to do with his teachings. So you don't have to do much research about David Koresh to find out that he was a polygamist. He didn't start out that way. When he first began teaching his message in 1983, he was, I would call him just a standard branch Davidian prophet. What does that mean? Well, branch Davidian, I think I explained last time, is a hyphenated term. There were Davidians, and there's branch Davidians. These movements have messages and messengers and from God. So when David Koresh began to teach, Vernon Howell, I'm going to call him Vernon from now on. Remember, when I say Vernon, I mean David Koresh. So Vernon began to teach in 1983, and he has to fit into the, let's just say, the culture of the group. He can't just come off out of left field with all kinds of crazy teachings. So he has to teach something that fits into what we already are learning or being taught from the current prophet. Actually, at the time, was Lois Roden. And she was the wife of Benjamin Roden, who had founded the Branch Davidians. Okay, so as time progressed, so from 1983 onward, right, so over the next approximately 10 years, 1983 to 1993 is the time span of the existence of Vernon and his teachings. His teachings evolved and changed over time. And so he married Rachel Jones. My wife grew up with Rachel. I will be very blunt. Rachel was not a very nice person. From the stories my wife has told me, plus my own personal experience with her and watching her, the way she treated other people. Now, I'm not saying that she was like evil or like the worst person in the world. I'm not saying that either. I'm just saying that, she's a human being. Everybody's different. She's one of those kind of people that a lot of people would not really like. Let's just put it that way. Could be mean, So, Vernon and Rachel got married in 1984, near the beginning of 1984. And he had previously been in a relationship with Lois Roden. According to Rachel's father, Perry Jones, when he saw them together, that is, when he saw Vernon Howell and Lois Roden together, it seemed like they were married. They acted like a married couple. Okay, so that's that. Now, they never were legally married. But if I was to speculate, I think Vernon's attempt to gain control of Lois Roden through this means did not work. Okay, because she was very strong-willed, so was he. So he went and tried something else. In other words, another tact. So in this case, you've got one of the top leaders of the group, which is Perry Jones. He has a young daughter, Rachel. She was 14. And it's legal to get married in Texas at the age of 14. At least it was in 1983 or 84. You just have to have parental consent. So David Koresh approached Perry and said that God told him to marry Rachel, which is entirely possible. What I mean by that is, and I'll cover this more later, in my opinion, and I've also talked to a relative of Vernon's, who has schizophrenia. They had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. I don't want to say much more about this person. I want to protect their privacy, but yeah. So a family relative, close family relative to Vernon Howell, to David Koresh, has been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and so it runs in the family, at least according to this person. They believe that it did, and based on my own experience with David Koresh, with Vernon, yeah, definitely had some neurodivergent stuff going on there, and schizophrenia fits well. So in other words, hearing voices. And one of the things about being schizophrenic and hearing voices is you're going to filter that through what you believe, right? So some people might hear voices and it's demons or whatever, angels, God, aliens. And it can cause a lot of trouble if it's not properly treated and diagnosed, because people will, they can become dangerous to themselves and others. So when I say that God told David Koresh something, this is probably what's going on. Now you might say, well, it's the voice telling him what he wants to do anyway. Well, yeah, that could be true, but in one particular important case, which I'll get into, it actually was not true. The voice told him to do something that he didn't want to do, which is interesting. Anyway, so Vernon starts out in early '84 with one legal wife, his wife Rachel Jones. There was a series, I can't remember, I think it was on Amazon, Waco series, which I did consult with the producer of that. Melissa Benoist played, I actually think she plays Supergirl. She played Rachel Howell in the series, which is pretty good choice. Yeah, similar looking, a little bit. Okay, so now after about a year, roughly a year and, well, no, this would be '84, so about 2 years later. Gotta stop saying so much. It's ridiculous. One of the things I try to do in public speaking is not stutter and say I, and don't say every other word. That makes you sound uncertain. So speak clearly and directly. Okay. Vernon came up with a new doctrine in 1986 where he took a second wife. Her name was Karen Doyle, and she was the daughter. She unfortunately is deceased. She was one of the ones that got away from the group and was living a quiet life, but unfortunately was in an automobile accident a few years ago and passed away. Unfortunately, that's sad. This was the daughter of Clive Doyle, who was an Australian immigrant to the United States. He also recently passed away last year. He was one of the survivors that got out on the day of the fire on April 19th, 1993. So she became his second wife. Now, this is not a legal marriage. This is a situation like TV shows like Big Love and reality shows where they show polygamous relationships. Obviously, there's no legality to the other marriages, and it's this situation in the Branch Davidian group with Vernon and his additional wives. So initially, we thought that it was just going to be having two wives. In fact, it was presented that way. But very quickly, over the course of the rest of the year, Vernon began to take other wives. And the next wife he took was Rachel's sister, Michelle. And she was very young. She was only 12 years old. There's another story I'll tell about that later on another presentation. But anyway, if you're getting kind of a revulsion at this stuff, I mean, I agree. It's pretty horrible, and I feel guilty about it to a certain degree. Um, my only defense is that I was so young and had been brought up in this group, roughly speaking. That is, I had been brought up with the idea that there are prophets and they have messages and you have to obey God and all that kind of thing. So, yeah. So this is how the polygamy starts in roughly 1986, and there are young girls and women in the group that are potentially available to become Vernon's wives, and so he begins to. Now, this is a voluntary thing, I guess. I mean, actually, as far as I'm concerned, Michelle Jones was raped. Excuse me. Yeah. So, I mean, it was arranged. He arranged the whole thing so that he could gain sexual access to her, and then that marriage to Michelle Jones was super duper secret. So I'm not saying all of these marriages were completely out in the open, since she was only 12 years old. That was ridiculously young. David Koresh, Vernon was a pedophile, in my opinion. I mean, that's not a professional clinical diagnosis, but when you are an adult grown man and you constantly desire to have sex with children, in my book, that makes you a pedophile. So that's what he was. Okay. So at the time, there actually was one individual in the group. His name, I won't say his name, one of the male members of the group who was married, actually predicted, and it was in kind of a fearful and angry way, that, oh, you're just going to try to get our wives, you know. And at the time, oh, no, Vernon's like, I would never take men's wives or anything like that, or other people were saying that. And I believed that too. Oh, he would never want to take a man's wife away from you. Of course not. And yet, if you study the historical documentation that we have, one of the things that is very well known, for example, is that Steve Schneider, who was David Koresh's right-hand man, who was not in the group at this time, by the way, in 1986. David Koresh's right-hand man, or at least he was just coming into the group, so he wasn't around at the time of the polygamy just beginning. He came in later. Steve Schneider's, he was from Hawaii. There was a contingent of converts that came in from Hawaii, from the Diamond Head Church in Hawaii, SDA Church, Seventh-day Adventist Church in Hawaii, and Steve Schneider and his wife Judy were among these individuals, and they were a happily married, very much in love couple. Now, I did not like Steve Schneider personally. He reminds me of kind of a car salesman, but again, that doesn't matter what I think of him. He was still a human being, and I'm not saying again that he was all bad or evil or anything. He's just not my kind of person. And of course, the cult, which this is a cult, and that's another word I'll use, definitely a cult, brings out the worst in people often. So if you're, it's not going to make you a better person, that's for sure. So this is a happily married couple. Now, Judy, Vernon perceived Judy to be very beautiful, okay, which is important. I found her to be okay, but that doesn't matter what I think. Vernon found her to be very beautiful. And probably was, if I know him and his stories, I mean, yes, that's the thing that when you know somebody, right, personally, and then you hear a story about them, it rings true, because yeah, I can see him doing that or not, whatever. You can kind of judge things that way. So that's kind of the thing I'll be doing a lot here. So yeah, certainly Vernon was lusting after Steve's wife probably from the very beginning. Okay, so it was a well-known fact that Steve Schneider's wife Judy was no longer considered to be Steve's wife. He was Judy's wife. Sorry. Judy was Vernon's wife, was considered to be Vernon's wife, and this is even presented in the formerly mentioned TV series, this relationship here. The details in that series about the interactions between individuals and Vernon's attitude and things like that, I found to be completely inaccurate. And I watched the first episode, and I saw the actor, who is a perfectly good actor, and portraying Vernon, David Koresh, in a particular way, and I was like, that's not David Koresh. So I lost interest because the character of David Koresh had been reinterpreted. And the producer's intent, he said he wanted to make him human. Well, you made him, it wasn't just that you made him human, you made him ridiculously nice. Vernon was not nice. A lot of times he wasn't very nice at all. He could be, but he was a mixed bag. So, yeah. So this condition of David Koresh, at this point, he is David Koresh, taking wives of men in the group was a thing. And that began in 1989. And when it was, so this was a big deal in the theological development of the group. That is, there's a body of teachings that come from David Koresh. And, he changed his name around 1990. So this would be around the time of what came the New Light. Okay, it was called, in the group, it was called the New Light. And a major feature of the New Light was that Vernon Howell, at the time he was still Vernon, like he said, one of the features of this New Light is that as a consequence of the New Light and the doctrines that he introduced, that's when he changed his name to David Koresh very shortly thereafter. It's like a theological name. So David Koresh started taking the wives of the men in the group. Now, one of the things that's important to understand is David Koresh never said, "I'm taking your wife." He was careful not to ever say that. And in one particular study that I have a transcript of, he even makes a comment. There are people out there saying, "I'm taking men's wives. How foolish can they be? I never taught that." Implying he never took anybody's wife. And you might say, well, how could he say that he didn't take anybody's wife if he clearly was involved in a sexual relationship with Judy Schneider and then she had a baby by him? How could he say that? Well, that's a really good question. And the answer to that is and this is my words, not his, but it's a good name for the doctrine that he came up with. And what David Koresh came up with is what I would call his doctrine of marriage nullification. He annulled the marriages in the group. So, we all know what that is. Like in the Catholic Church, for example, they have a doctrine of marriage nullification, right? If you get married, but things don't go right and you want to dissolve the marriage, the Catholic Church, under certain circumstances, can grant a marriage nullification. And in case the marriage is declared null and void and there never was a marriage legally. And then you're fine to not be married anymore. So that's essentially what Vernon did at the time, is he nullified the marriages of all the men and women in the group. Now, this is where me and my wife come in. And to understand what we went through, we have to go back in time. So this is 1989, so we have to rewind 4 years to 1985, which I had previously mentioned. This is a year after Vernon married Rachel, and then we were living in a place called Palestine, Texas. And so I was allowed to marry my wife in 1985. We were allowed to get married, even though my wife was underage. Now, the circumstances around this are very unusual. So let me explain. So I met my wife in 1984. When I was 19, she was 15. We fell in love. And I mean, it happens all the time with teenagers, but it worked out with us. I mean, we actually really did click and fall in love, and we're still together now, and we're happily married, and we have 3 children and 8 grandchildren, and it's all wonderful, and I like being married. So it worked out. I mean, I agree. Typically 19-year-olds and 15-year-olds getting together. Well, we were 20. I was 20 and she was 17 when we got married. But, I understand it's unusual. It was an unusual situation. We were living in an unusual time for us. So I wouldn't condone it normally for my own children. Although one of my daughters did get married very young, about 20. Anyway, or 18, I think. Yeah, so it worked out for her too. Okay, so now this is my first relationship ever. So, it was very traumatic and emotional and everything, but I finally settled down, emotionally, and they got to the point about a year into the relationship where I was getting frustrated with the attitude towards my relationship with Deborah, my wife. The other members of the group were still viewing us as we're doing something wrong, just being next to each other. And this was an attitude that had been absorbed from Vernon himself. Vernon had, over the course of our relationship, the previous 12 months, from September 85, the previous 12 months, the previous year, had just come up with all kinds of really stupid restrictions, and at times don't talk to each other, and I don't want to see you next to each other, and oh my God, it was just so stupid. It wasn't necessary, but whatever. So one of the problems is this is an apocalyptic group. So the end of the world is coming. And so you want to not get involved in things that distract you from the business at hand, which is saving the world, spreading the message. But of course he was married to Rachel. This was before the polygamy thing. So kind of not, he's kind of not really living up to his own expectations, right? Of others. So I approached Vernon Howell one night on a cold September 30th night, 1985, and I was frustrated because I was starting to mature in my attitude toward my relationship with my wife. It was developing into something, this isn't a crush anymore. This isn't just, I'm starting to solidify my feelings and my love and my devotion into something solid in my mind is forming. And as a consequence, well, it's not even a consequence, it's a good thing. I'm becoming more confident in this. I can now start to speak about it in a confident manner. And if someone wants to challenge me, I can say, hey, I love her. You can't tell me that I don't. Okay, I don't want to hear about, you don't know what you're thinking, or you don't know what you're doing, or you're too young, or whatever, because that's all the crap they throw at you sometimes when you're young, right? And I mean, I suppose there's some truth to it sometimes, but still you got to go through it yourself. You can't, everybody's got to go through these things themselves, and when it comes to love and all these types of things. So I had been through all that and had become more mature in my attitude. And so I approached him frustrated, like, when do we get to go into the next phase of this thing? This is getting ridiculous. When do I get to be, I guess I don't know if I use this word, but I wanted to be engaged or something, so that or betrothed, whatever, right? Probably the word I would have used back then, more religious sounding. Now I wasn't talking to him to get any kind of approval in the sense of, oh yeah, you can do whatever you want, David, or whatever. I mean, I just was trying to let him know I was frustrated and kind of going to him to get some counseling. I mean, he was sympathetic, amazingly so, amazingly sympathetic, and he did listen to me, which again, that was interesting. He was not a good listener. I mean, He was always like on the go, running around doing things. And if he had 5 minutes for you, you were lucky. But I got his attention. He listened to me. He was sympathetic. And then I went to bed, which was a tent. We were living in very Spartan conditions at the time. So the next thing I know, from my perspective, is my wife is coming into my tent. It's late at night. It's the early morning, actually. Okay, so I'll stop right there. This obviously was very shocking to me. Okay, so what happened? Okay. Now, the reason I know what happened is because the story was told the next day. Vernon Howell himself told the story to the congregation to explain what had happened to David and Debbie. Why are they now together? You know, this was like a complete shift in position. You know, the previous day, not being able to even come with, you know, to stay at arm's length from each other. That was a rule. Stay at arm's length. And then the next day, you know, we're hugging and holding hands and, you know, like newly married couples will do. Yeah. So what happened? I mean, that's the way he was. Quite frankly, looking back, I wish I could have just gotten engaged and had like a set a date and had a normal wedding ceremony. But, you know, that he didn't think that way. So it was what it was. So what happened? Well, so now I'm relating his story that he told himself. This is Vernon Howell talking, David Koresh talking, giving his own testimony. I walked off into the darkness to my tent, and this is a cold night, fall night in central Texas, and there was a fire crackling at his feet, and he's cracking branches between two trees close together, cracking the limbs, and he's putting them down on the fire. And he said that, well, you know, poor David, you know, I wish that I could help him, you know, in his mind thinking about what I just told him and how unfortunate it is that this is the way things are, and, you know, we're trying to do this message and we don't have time to fall in love and get married and all that kind of stuff. And then he hears the voice that I told you about earlier. Let them marry. And he's like, what? Lord, are you sure? They're so young. And let them marry. Okay? And that's it. And he's like, you know, okay. He doesn't agree personally, but all right. So then he wakes my wife up, who's sleeping in the other direction from where I walked off to. She's in a tent as well, and it's late. This is probably, you know, midnight roughly, and calls her over and then gives her a big long talk. You know, my wife later told me it was like he didn't understand completely how she felt about me, which is bizarre. I mean, it's clear she loved me just as much as I loved her. This is mutual. So after this long talk and cautioning and, you know, gives her a choice, you know, you can walk that way or you can walk that way, you know, it's your decision. And then he turned his back and then she made her decision, which of course leads to the point that I told you about. The next thing I know, she's coming into my tent. And then of course there has to be a quick explanation of what happened. And, you know, the rest is history. We obviously weren't legally married, but we did the next few days get a marriage license, and her mother signed it, and we became legally married. So yeah. Okay, so the important thing to note here, which I'm strongly emphasizing, is the nature of our marriage from the perspective of David Koresh, is our marriage was sanctioned by God himself, straight from the horse's mouth. And in September of 1985, or October 1st, 1985 at this point, there's no polygamy. It's just, if you can still get married, any woman in the group, if she get permission, can get married to anybody else. And Vernon Howell has one legal wife, Rachel Howell, and that's the way it was. And our marriage is sanctioned by God. Okay. Now, where did I leave off from the New Light doctrine? The marriage nullification. Now, when the New Light came down, me and my wife were no longer in the group. We had been kicked out. And we were kicked out on Vernon's third attempt, which was successful. He had tried to get rid of our marriage 2 previous times, in which I'll explain what he did. The first one is, on one sense, hilarious and also very disturbing. So it was, let's just say, spring of 1989. So this is a few months before the New Light. So I don't have direct evidence of this, but you just have to kind of go from a likely human behavior model, right? If in August of 1989, David Koresh drops this bomb on the group that, hey, I'm taking all the wives away. So he's going to destroy marriages and break up marriages. All right, he's going to take Steve and Judy Schneider, who genuinely love each other very much, and they have to never be together again, and see each other every day and never be together again. I mean, if you think about that, it's like the worst thing in the world, right? It's absolutely, and it was horrible for Steve. It was absolutely torturous. So, obviously, in the lead up to dropping this bomb on the group, he's going to be thinking about it in his head for a while. He has to develop the strategy. How am I going to do this? Of course, the marriage nullification is probably something he hit on very quickly. And the reason I know this is because the marriage nullification doctrine was, your marriages are not sanctioned by God. Get it? Well, he's got a big problem, and he knows it, even though he never said this, never told anybody about it, but it's obvious from, if you know the facts, which very few people do. Because a lot of the people that would know this would be passed away now. They would have died in the fire, or they would have died of old age at this point. He's got to get rid of me and my wife's marriage. This is 4 years later, and things have changed, right? There's polygamy now, and now he's trying to figure out how to get all the women. I will stop here and tell a little story out of, again, this is out of David Koresh's mouth to try to illustrate what I think his personality is like, even though he was trying to illustrate something else when he was telling the story. He told a story one time about when he was a child, and he's visiting a family friend of his mother or something, and there is a collection of toy cars. Beautiful. And little Vernon sees all these cars, and the woman that they're visiting notices, oh, would you like one of those? And Vernon goes, I want them all. I want them all. And Bonnie, his mother's like, Vernon, you're embarrassing me. You can't have them all. Stop it. I want them all. He starts crying, and he doesn't get anything. He gets dragged out, screaming and crying, because he wanted them all. Well, yeah, this is the way he was with the women in the group. He wanted them all. Even if they were elderly, the concept was, look, he's got control, and he can do what he wants. I'm sure there were women that he didn't actually sleep with, but still, he could have if he wanted to. That was the idea. And even if they, I think he made a few exceptions to let some couples stay together, because there was one Australian couple that he let stay together because they were older And he knew that if they, in their case, if he didn't, that they would leave the group, and he didn't want them to. So he would like grant a disposition, this, like a papal disposition, like equivalent, oh, I give you a special disposition, dispensate, whatever you call it, to not have to do the thing that I'm telling everybody else to do. So, okay. So in the beginning of 1989, I theorize that Vernon realizes he has a problem. If he's going to enact this doctrine of marriage nullification, right? So he's seeing the following scenario. He's going to be giving a study, right, of his new light, and I'm going to be sitting in the room, and he's going to be up front, and he's going to say, the new light is marriages are not sanctioned by God. And I'm going to raise my hand, and I'm going to say, excuse me, you sanctioned my marriage out of your own mouth. And a lot of people here are witnesses to that. So my marriage is sanctioned by God. He doesn't want to have to deal with that, and he knows it. He's very conscious of it. So he's got to solve this problem. So attempt number one. One day, just randomly out of the blue, because that's the way he was. He never warned you or planned fucking anything. That was one of his huge problems. He was horrible at logistics. He just calls my wife over to his stupid Camaro, vanity project, if there ever was one. 69 Camaro or something. I remember one time, he had an Alpine stereo in that thing. And like, this is an expensive stereo. I remember one time I was in a room in the church, and I saw the box to that stereo sitting up on a shelf. And I looked at that and I was like, how come I don't get an Alpine stereo? How come he gets an Alpine stereo and I don't get one? This is a theoretical thing that I'm thinking. Basically, I'm being rebellious, I suppose. I'm thinking again, this is the kind of stuff that when you're in a cult, it's pulling you in two different directions. Oh, I need to be obedient. Wait a minute, that fucker gets to have a stereo, when that's ridiculous. It's obviously a violation of some kind of principle of that he supposedly believes. He's being a hypocrite, in other words. He gets a stereo because he fucking wants one. That's why he gets a stereo, okay? That's what cult leaders do. They abuse their power. Vernon calls my wife over to the Camaro, and then she just has to get in. He says, get in, And, yeah. So all of a sudden, I see my wife driving off with Vernon, and maybe some other people. One of his other wives, Nicole Gent, who has passed away. Ugh. No, I didn't like Nicole. Yeah, that's all I'll say. Anyway, so this relationship between Nicole and Vernon was a newer relationship. This is one of his newer wives that he had acquired, and maybe in the last few months or so. My wife is actually sitting in the back seat of the Camaro, and so Vernon's in the driver's seat, and Nicole is sitting next to him, and they're going through their lovey-dovey phase of their relationship, and Vernon looks over to the fields. This is, out in farm country. He says, my wife is telling me this later. She looks over and he says, oh, the fields around here are so fertile. And Nicole looks over and says, I noticed that. My wife is in the back seat going, ah. So that's the scene, right? She has to put up with these idiots. And Vernon is up to no good, I can tell you that. So I'll try to shorten the story up. Basically what happens is Vernon takes my wife to a restaurant in Waco, city of Waco, which is about 13 miles away from Mount Carmel, where we were living. And then he subjects her to an interrogation that lasted at least an hour, if not more, surrounded by a bunch of his favorite people. So she's sitting on the floor in this circle, and everybody's sitting around her, including Vernon. So like an inquisition. And for the next hour or so, he is pressuring her to voluntarily give up my marriage, and marry him. Again, this wouldn't be a legal marriage. This is, this is within the group's understanding. She's going to voluntarily leave me. She's going to tell me, David, I'm leaving you, and I'm going to now marry Vernon, and we're going to be married. He's so you can see what he's doing here based on what I've already told you. He's got to destroy the marriage. He's got to get rid of it, and he's got to get her to volunteer. Now, knowing Vernon, what he did is he probably thought about this for several weeks, and he fantasized about it in his head. Yeah, if I just talk to her, and I just tell her the right things, and he got himself completely delusional about it. Now, if he'd asked me, I could have told him, Vernon, you'll have a better success if you get up one morning before the sun rises and command the sun to not rise. You will have a better chance at success than trying to dislodge my wife away from me. Okay, now I know marriage relationships can vary in terms of how husbands and wives and what they know about each other, and maybe you'll say, well, some husbands don't really understand their wives, and maybe they would leave them. I can just tell you, okay? And again, we've been together for almost 40 years. At that point in my marriage with my wife in 1989, I can tell you one thing. You're not going to leave me. Absolutely not. And certainly not for that piece of shit. Okay? She did not like him. Women watching this video, guys that make your skin crawl, you're like, ooh, yeah, he's one of those kind of guys. Just fucking creepy as fuck, okay? So women will know exactly what I'm talking about. Just creeps you the fuck out. Of course, not all women thought he was creepy, but I mean, a lot of women did. So, the end result of this is, of course, she didn't leave me. She had to essentially talk him down, okay, off the ledge. He had worked himself up to this ledge that he's getting ready to jump off of. And he had actually tried to do something similar to this years earlier. He had a girlfriend, and I know this because I spoke to her a few years ago. There's a book coming out, and through the production of the book, the author of the book found out about her. She found out about me and asked the author, how do you know all this stuff? Well, there's this guy. So we spoke a few times, communicated about Vernon, because she knew Vernon before any of us did. Back in her day, when they were together, he actually at one point tried to kidnap her and put her in the trunk of his car. Like he comes to visit you, he's crying. I gotta take you away. You're mine. We're married. And she again had to talk him down. Now at this point, he's like not saying he's a prophet. It's just Vernon. He doesn't have a message. He doesn't have a group of people that are kissing his ass. So yeah. So anyway. She talks him down. Of course, in this sense, he's far less humble than he would have been with his girlfriend. He probably, with the girlfriend, the previous years, the talking down resulted in him being humiliated and, I'm sorry, I went crazy in my head. I didn't know what I was doing. But with my wife, of course, he has to maintain this haughty attitude, just put on. Obviously, he's failed. He's not going to be able to break up the marriage. Now, the thing that's important to know is he threatened me. He said, if you tell David, I'll get my men together and we'll beat him up. And that was not an idle threat. That would have absolutely happened. I can tell you that right now. So she didn't tell me. She told me, obviously I saw her drive off, so she had to tell me something. But she told me an extremely cleaned up version of this story, where essentially Vernon was like, well, I've heard you two are having problems in your marriage and you better clean it up because, blah, blah. It didn't really make a whole lot of sense. But what? It's my wife. I wasn't aware that she was lying to me. I mean, she's lying to me because she loves me. She was worried about me. So I didn't find out about the true story of this till, it was a while before she told me, because she was just very traumatized. I mean, he was horrible. Okay. This man was, you don't even know. Anyway, Okay, so that's attempt one, crash and burn. He's still got this problem. It's not going away. Okay, well, attempt number two had to do with, unfortunately, there was another incident between Vernon and my wife that had happened years previously. Long story short, they were in a kitchen together, and he had been sleeping in the kitchen. She was assigned as to cook in the kitchen, and he was walking around in front of her in his underwear, which he wasn't supposed to do. This is again before polygamy, before any of that stuff. This is supposed to be just standard, hey, very conservative religious group, you don't expose your bodies to other people, it's immoral, blah, blah, blah. And he's in his underwear. And the way my wife described to me later is some kind of sexual harassment going on here. And probably motivated by the fact that my wife again is very attractive, I'm not going to lie. He's married, but he hasn't been able probably to have sex in several months because his wife just had a baby and she wasn't feeling like it. And so he's a young guy, super high libido, as you can probably figure based on what I'm telling you. He's harassing my wife. Now, the end result of all this is nothing really happened except, I think he told her, oh, you're so beautiful and all that creepy bullshit that creepy guys tell women. But nothing happened beyond she saw him in his underwear, which is not supposed to happen. So anyway, unfortunately, my wife wasn't really thinking clearly. Years later, around the same time as the incident, but this would have been afterwards, about the same time as the incident with, being abducted and pressured to leave me, she was just shooting the shit with my sister and another woman these are two women that are also married to him, to David Koresh. And she just tells this funny story about one time Vernon walked around right in front of me in my underwear, isn't that silly? Well, my sister, I don't talk to my sister, haven't talked to her for years. My sister didn't like this, I guess because she was jealous or whatever. Didn't have much sympathy for my wife, which is not surprising given my sister. Probably blamed her in some way. So anyway, I don't know, shortly thereafter, they drank alcohol, by the way. They would all get together, Vernon and some of his people that he wanted to have around at the time, and they would drink. And my sister got a little tipsy, and, truth starts coming out. She's bitching about things she's resenting, and this thing about the story with Debbie comes out, and he's like, oh, what's that? He sees an opportunity. Now, he denied the story that he walked around in front of her in his underwear. So there was a trial. We actually, swear to God, went up to the church, and he stands up in front and gives his testimony, and everybody in the congregation is there. And then he gives my wife a chance to give her story. And my wife, boy, she's a trooper. When she gets a chance to speak, she speaks clearly and directly, looks him right in the eye, and she tells him exactly what happened. Well, it was so-and-so, and you did this and that, and that's it. I was so proud of her. There you go, fucker. And then the most amazing thing happened. Vernon's argument was that, I would never walk in front of a woman in my underwear because I have chicken legs. I'm very ashamed of my legs, so I would never do that. And he actually was quizzing Rachel. He was actually quizzing Rachel to back him up on this. And Rachel was not cooperating. So this is his first wife. Rachel actually, now that I think about it, had been at the restaurant the day that he was pressuring my wife to leave me for him, and Rachel was there, and she wasn't happy about that at all. And she was saying, this is wrong and don't do this. She never didn't tell me because she was scared to tell me. But Rachel had grown up with my wife on Mount Carmel together from little children. And Rachel was like, don't do this, and had been against that back then. So when I said that Rachel was mean, I'm not saying that she was 100% bad. She wasn't. I mean, she's a person, complex person. So Rachel that day Vernon's up there, expecting to get some cooperation from her. Hey, back me up on this. Isn't this true? Isn't Debbie lying? And she's like, and he's like, we're going to talk later. Now, probably what happened is, part of the story I didn't tell you is that in this kitchen, it's a fairly large kitchen, because it's a kitchen that's designed also, it's for a church complex. It was a place we were renting in the Passover season, which would be the equivalent to Easter, 1985. And so there was a large kitchen with a seating area. There was a lot of room in there. And Vernon had been sleeping in there with his wife. His wife was asleep in the room at the time that he was walking around in his underwear in front of my future wife. Now, it's quite possible that she was awake, but just, that kind of thing, very possible. And she knew all along what he had done, because that's how she acted, that she knew Debbie was telling the truth. And other women in the group actually went to my wife later and sympathized with her, that they knew that now, was he lying in the sense that he knew he had done it, but he was denying it, or did he just not remember? He possibly might not have remembered. I don't know. But anyway, the end result of that is another crash and burn. And again, he tries to stay haughty up there in the pulpit, pretending like, he's still really stuck it to my wife. But no, he's lost. So attempt number 2 has failed. And I'm like, boy, because I don't know what's going on, right? Okay, you have to understand what I'm telling you now, that he's trying to destroy them or get rid of us so that he can take all the wives. I don't know that yet. I just don't want to be kicked out of the group. First of all, I don't have a job. I don't have a place to live. I don't have any money. I don't have anything. So, yeah, like, I have a little daughter. She's 3 years old. My wife is pregnant. So, okay. Well, we had been attending a trade school. My wife was going to secretarial classes, and I was taking drafting classes, learning AutoCAD, the computer software used to do drafting. And that's what I still do to this day, thank goodness. That's another story, which is boring, but yeah, that fucker, man. He got in my way at every turn, trying to just learn a living. But I did figure out how to get the classes and eventually graduated and was able to earn a living, but wasn't no thanks to him. So third attempt was successful. What happened was that we were coming home from school one day, and we were told, because we would be gone, we were told, you guys are in a lot of trouble. Vernon's not here. He went off to town to get something, and you better just go and sit down and wait for your lickings or whatever. Oh God, well, now what? So what had happened is, while we were gone, because he's, I guess, a fucking coward, I don't know, he decides to go into our house, our room. It's like a little house that's a duplex, and we were living in one side, and he broke through it's a shared bathroom, by the way. So a central bathroom and then 2 rooms on either side, and we're sharing one side. So he goes through the other house, goes through the bathroom, and we had put a lock on the door because there was a little girl that lived next door to us that liked to come in and snoop. It's just a little kid, whatever. And we put a lock on the door just to keep her from getting in. Well, he just busted that lock down. He claimed that we were trying to lock him out, like, whatever. No, duh. A little tiny lock like that's not going to stop you. And he found food that was not allowed. It was illegitimate food, whatever. He found some ramen noodles or something. I don't know. Whatever. Some insignificant, stupid thing that it was just a technicality. Other people in the group ate far worse things than that, his mother included. But he's got to get rid of us, see? He's desperate. So he breaks in, he finds some things he doesn't like, and, so now there's a trial. I'm not going to bore you, sit there for hours, and I'm crying. I don't want to. I'm just mad with grief, and I don't know what's going on. I'm completely, I don't want to use the word brainwashed, but I mean, I'm just, I'm gone. Mentally, I just am not thinking clearly. My wife was not in that frame of mind. She was sick and tired of his shit. But, you know, one of the things about my wife that I give her credit for, she never tried to, I mean, maybe she should have a little bit, but she never tried to like tell me what to think, right? Or you've got to think this way, or you've got to think that way, or you have to do this, or she always wanted me to figure things out for myself, which I eventually did. So, it's not that she wasn't confused too, but she was also mad because she knew it was bullshit. Because she knew some things that he had been doing that I didn't know. Remember, she hadn't told me the truth about trying to take her. I was in the dark about a lot of things. So, yeah, we got kicked out. $20 in my pocket, just my car. And yeah, I had to sleep in the car one night and then went through, you know, all that difficulty. But, you know, worked it out. Got some help from my mom. Got on my feet. It turned out okay. But, and then a year later is when I'll tell that story. The next story would be to tell the story of how I made my mental break. Because the weird thing is, even though I'm not in the group anymore, you know, I still am in there in my head. So, and I'll tell that story next time. But yeah, it's during the time that we're gone. Obviously, this is on Star Wars Day, May 4th, 1989. That's how I remember. So after we're gone, right? We're kicked out in May. In August, so just a few months later, then the new light gets dropped, and now. Marriage nullification. God never approved any of your marriages. The word comes out of David Koresh's mouth. David and Debbie are gone. He doesn't have to worry about that. And what he was waiting for, I got through the grapevine, putting some pieces together, is he thought that me and Debbie out in the world, so to speak, is what we were in, right? You're in the group and then you're in the world. So we're out in this wicked world and we would just turn on each other and get divorced. And then he would have called me up and said, okay, David, you can come back now. Right? That's what he was waiting for. He was waiting to hear word that David and Debbie were not together anymore. Again, this fucktard, he can't get this fantasy out of his head. You're not going to get us apart. There's nothing that's going to get me away from my wife. You're just two people sometimes you just know. Right? You're never going to be apart. I mean, so, yeah. That was the last thing in the world that would ever happen. So there you go. That's the story of marriage nullification and my involvement in one of David Koresh's most horrible doctrines, the destruction of marriages. Till next time.